Hey, thanks everyone for joining our webinar today in our topic of how to build equity in your corporation. It actually stemmed from our conversation that Carl and I had talking about some realtors in the business who have, like I know one realtor in particular who's been in the industry for like 35 years, making six figures a year for 30 years. But at the end of the day, after 30 years, this individual has no assets, basically no equity in her corporation. And so it was like one of my pain points or my passions is to help my clients build wealth and build real estate portfolio and also alternative investments. And seeing people who have the money making ability, but not being able to build wealth after decades of working, it just breaks my heart. So I'm really glad to have Carl here to share with us insight and strategies on this topic. So over to you, Carl.
Thanks, Gary. So yeah, that's exactly it. That's a very good way to frame the whole discussion that I wanted to have today in talking about building equity in your corporation. There's a lot of important reasons for doing so, and probably that's one of the most important, that a lot of people end up working for a long time without really getting anywhere. And I just want to explore kind of that pain point a little bit, why it comes about, and what we might be able to do about it. So as Gary mentioned, what we want to look at is business owners, and we want to look at the reason why business owners sometimes don't seem to get ahead. They might have an amazing business. They might make a lot of money, and they might do so for a lot of years, but then they find 25, 30 years later, they really didn't build up all that much equity. They don't have a lot of assets. So why is that? The way that I like to frame a lot of these discussions is with the cash flow quadrants. So I'll just use that as a reference point again today. I think it's useful to have that in the back of our minds because we can remember why we're doing the kind of things we're doing if your vision is in line with this cash flow quadrants, which I believe most business owners would be. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the cash flow quadrants. There are 4 quadrants, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the whole idea is that we want to move from one to the other. We want to progress through the quadrants. Everybody starts, well, most people anyway, start right here. Most people will start their professional career as an employee. They'll work for somebody else. So typically that's what an employee is. Employee is somebody who's basically trading time for money. Somebody else, they're building somebody else's business. So that's employee. So you can kind of tell from my tone, I think, that we don't really want to be an employee. That's not where we want to stay for the rest of our lives. There are certain employees that might make a lot of money if they have some kind of special skill, but it's not really, for most of us, a place that we want to be. So everybody dreams of leaving employment and starting their own business. It's the American/Canadian dream. So they want to move down here and they want to become self-employed. So everybody thinks that's the holy grail. Now I've become self-employed. I'm no longer working for the man. I'm working for myself. So we've made a big leap. Now we're really happy. But what we find over time is we think we're working for ourselves, which in a way we are, but we're just working for our clients. We're not really getting anywhere. We're just working day after day after day. And where we did have a boss here, we've got our client bosses here telling us what to do every day. So we didn't really kind of get that far. We made an important step, but we didn't get to where we wanted to be. Where we really wanted to be was to be a business owner. And what this means is now we've got the systems and we've got the people in place, likely these people here, the employees, where this business is operating itself. So we no longer have to operate that business ourselves. The business is operating itself. We've given ourselves that kind of freedom. And then when we go to the final one, that is investor. Now, potentially here we are, and we've got a number of different assets below us. Some of those assets might be business, might be real estate, probably a few businesses. That's essentially where we want to get to right there. So that just gives us some framework. I don't want to make the whole thing about just the cash flow quadrants, but it gives us a framework of what this issue actually is. So one thing that we hear about a lot of employees is that they live paycheck to paycheck. So every 2 weeks, every month, they get a paycheck, and that paycheck goes to pay their rent or their mortgage, their food, their kids' school, clothes. Their income always equals their expenses. So this is your employee living paycheck to paycheck, not really getting anywhere. So then we move again, as we talked, from employee to business owner. We think, okay, now, or sorry, employee to self-employed. So we think to ourselves, okay, now I'm no longer going to be living to paycheck. I'm going to build something here. Now I finally have the chance to build a business. And this business is going to be so valuable that I'm no longer on this hamster wheel of constantly trying to get ahead and being brought down and constantly being ahead and brought down. I can finally get off this wheel. But what we find is that we move from paycheck to paycheck to invoice to invoice. So now we're in a situation where we've got all this revenue coming into the business, but we've now got business expenses. And now we've got income that we're paying out of the business to ourselves, but that is offset by our own personal expenses. So we've basically increased our revenue and we've increased our expenses at the same rate. So now we're in a situation where our income and revenue equals our business and personal expenses. So we didn't really get too far. And I think this is something that a lot of people would be pretty familiar with. This is what we want to deal with today. So how do I get myself in a situation where I'm not just paying for my business expenses and my personal expenses with my revenue and my income? So what is it that's getting in the way of being able to do that? What kind of things do you think get in the way of being able to break this cycle, this hamster wheel that we're on? Yeah, so I think these three things are going to be very important for us to figure out how to do this. Leveraging, I think when we look at this whole cash flow quadrant, I think it's an important message. Here, we're not leveraging anything. I guess in a sense, we're leveraging our own skill, but we're not leveraging anything outside of ourselves. When we get to this stage, I think we're probably just leveraging our own skills a little bit more because somebody else isn't taking a cut of our own skills, right? Now we're starting to leverage people and systems when we become a business owner. Probably when we become an investor, one of the things we're probably going to leverage is other people's money. So I think leveraging is going to play a part in any way to move ahead. If we're in this situation, we're going to have to leverage something. So one thing that I wanted to point out, so I will get back to this leverage. I want to make sure that you know that I'm not just kind of leaving it behind. But yeah, I think the mindset is kind of a given. I'm not going to specifically go into this, but how about strategy? I think strategy is probably where we want to start here. What's our strategy? So what do we need to start with in any kind of strategy? If we're in a military expedition, for example, if you're Ukraine and you're fighting with the Russians and you've got to come up with some kind of strategy, the first thing you have to do is identify the goals that you're trying to achieve here, right? So in the Ukraine, they might say that they want to boot out the Russians, right? So the Ukrainians want to get out the Russians. They're going to come up with a strategy. Number one, what's our goal? So that is very important to establish right at the beginning. It's part of our mindset in that we even come up with a strategy, that we even start to plan these things. So we want to come up with a goal, and the goal right here, it's kind of already encapsulated in what we're talking about, is that we want to get off that hamster wheel. We want to stop going paycheck to paycheck or invoice to invoice. That's our goal, but we're going to have to quantify that. So we're going to have to come up with a number. What is it we want to achieve? We're talking about equity in the business. What does that mean for you? I have some clients who would say, I want $500 million within the corporation. That might not be a goal for everybody. It's a goal for some people. Everybody's got their number. Somebody else might say, I want $5 million in the corporation. So we're going to have to come up with a number, and we're going to have to come up with, of course, a time period where we want to achieve that. So I want to achieve $500 million over the next 25 years. So I want to achieve $5 million over the next 10 years. What is the number that we're looking for? And what's the time period that we have to achieve this? Ukraine wants the Russians out. They're going to be realistic. They're not going to say, we want the Russians out by tomorrow. They understand they're not going to achieve that. They're not going to know exactly what that time frame is. Maybe they're going to say, we want the Russians out within 6 months, and they're going to use potentially diplomacy, fighting, different strategies, tactics to get them out, but they're going to need that 6 months, and the Russians out is going to be their goal. So what is our number and what is our time period? So if you feel comfortable, I would appreciate it if you could put in the chat, even if you put something fake, I don't really care. Just start thinking about this. What is your number and what is your time period? If you start thinking about, how am I going to get off this hamster wheel? Because again, when Gary talks about mindset, one of the mindsets is this: hey, I don't know when I'm ever going to make money with this corporation. It kind of scares me to think about this, because if I think about trying to achieve $5 million in 10 years and I don't make it, then what happened? Well, I failed in that situation, right? You might consider yourself to be a failure. That's why it's so important to consider this mindset, because we have to get over those kind of things if we want to achieve these kind of goals. So mindset is very important in coming up with these kind of numbers to begin with. Mindset is necessary for us even to look at starting to go into a strategy, right? So if you could think of a number and a time period where you want to achieve that, again, it doesn't have to be real. I just want you guys to start thinking about these things and put it in the chat. Yesterday. So we might have to talk about being realistic with our goals a little bit there, Mike. 1 million 3 years. That's good. $50 million. And what's your time period, Gary? Lifetime. That's good. That's perfect. Cool. So yeah, that's really helpful. It gives me a little bit of a litmus test of where we are. So again, I think this mindset, it kind of, I was going to kind of wash over this term a little bit, but I think it's really key to our thinking here. One of the mindsets that we need to put in place here is, you might have heard this one before, fake it till you make it. And I want to get technical. I don't want to stay kind of in mindset for too long, because I think you guys came for a technical answer. But we need to think about this because it is important for us. Maybe some of you guys already have this down, but I think it's important for us all to be on the same page here when we're thinking about mindset, because we need to be in the right frame of mind to come up with the strategy where we can start. And it's funny, where we can start, because we actually have the 3 different elements from what you guys have said that we can work with, where we can start to leverage a strategy to get ahead. So the reason I bring up this concept, fake it till you make it, we've all heard this, I think, already in a business perspective, where maybe we don't know everything we need to know in our particular field, or maybe we don't believe we're the kind of people that do succeed in our kind of field. So we start to dress the part, we start to say the words, we start to pretend like we're in that situation already, with the idea that we will live into that person that we're actually starting to create for ourselves. We're not the kind of people that dressed well or talked well or had good manners or whatever. So we started to take that on so that we would actually fill those boots and actually become that person. So what we want to do when we're considering this whole idea of being stuck with income equal expenses, or going invoice to invoice, is we have to start thinking of ourselves as the next stage. So key to that, of course, was to start our strategy with numbers. So when we're thinking of achieving our number, so we want to achieve our goals, of course. So what specifically, from a technical financial perspective, what are some of the roadblocks that stand in our way of moving to the next step? And I'm not asking business, I'm not asking, hey, I just don't have enough clients, or I'm not charging enough, or something like that. Yeah, so I think a big one is taxes. That's one that really makes a lot of us stumble. Yeah, having the planning in place. One thing that can be very important for a business is knowing your numbers. So knowing exactly what your financial position is at any one time. And again, mindset can get in the way of that, because some people, they have certain fears around finances, and maybe they put their head in the sand and they don't look at their numbers as much as they should. But planning is important. Taxes is very important. Valuation, I think, is really important also, because we're trying to build a business that has some equity. So what is the value of that business over time? Bitcoin, yeah, so Bitcoin, I think, can be endemic of making investments. So investment volatility might be an issue, depending on the investment. If this was some kind of market investment, if it's another kind of investment like cash, maybe the low rate of return might be the issue. Yeah, so I think we have a lot of good ideas here. One thing I just want to focus on to begin with is the whole taxes idea, because I think this one can have a very big impact on your ability to achieve your goals. So again, I don't know what stage of your business you're at right now. You're either going to experience a lot of tax now or a lot of tax later. That's generally how taxes go. So this is an example that I think we can give pretty straightforward of why tax has such a big impact on our business. So say you had $100 and say that was $100 of income, and you had to pay $50 in tax. So I think we can do the math there, that we end up with $50. So that's what's left with us. So some people think, hey, I can just put my money in the market and I can make a lot of money on that. And that's how I'm going to get rich. I don't have to do the tax planning because I'm such an amazing investor. But part of the issue is, now that I've paid 50% tax on my $100, what return do I need to get on this $50 to get it back up to $100? And it's a little bit of a trick question, but it's kind of not a trick question at the same time. So I paid 50% tax on this $100, and then I ended up with $50. What do I need? What kind of rate of return do I need to get back to that $100 again? So I don't want to keep you hanging too long. I need 100% rate of return on that investment to bring my money back up to the $100. So you can see the impact of tax. We might not think it's such, you probably do, but some people might not think it's such a big deal that we pay the 50% tax. But you can see the huge drag on our ability to make that money back over time, because you need such a huge rate of return to recover from the fact that you lost 50% of the value on that tax to begin with. So tax can be a very big issue that we have to overcome for us to be able to build that kind of equity inside our corporation. I think these other things, they're very important too. I just wanted to focus on that one. So just kind of more as an example. So I think we focused a lot on kind of the issues, and we've started to identify how we're going to get out of this, at least from a strategic point of view. We're going to have to get a mindset that works. We're going to have to come up with some kind of strategy once we're kind of straight enough to actually deal with the problem that we've got in front of us. And then we're going to have to leverage something in order to start moving ahead. We can just make a lot of money. We could. It is an option, just to increase our revenues so much that we increase our income so much that it's way bigger than our expenses. We could decrease our expenses too. So that is a very simple option. Simple in that it's very easy to understand, but could be very difficult to put into practice, right? So what is something else that we could do? One thing that we could do is we could deal with these taxes, which we've already identified, and we can start to leverage something. So we're going to start leveraging, and we're going to start dealing with that tax. So maybe not all of you have this as an expense already, but many people do within their corporation. And I'm going to go over an idea with you. So what we would like to do ideally is turn whatever expenses we can into income. So what do we have that's a big negative on the balance sheet already that we could potentially turn into a positive? Can we start leveraging, and I'm using the word fairly loosely, I understand. Can we start leveraging our expenses to create some kind of assets within our corporation so that income becomes assets? And this is the idea. So we have one expense, which is, and again, maybe not all of us have it, but which is life insurance within the corporation. So when we're converting our expenses into assets, this is the one that I would suggest that we'd want to focus on, life insurance. So essentially with life insurance, what we can do is we can pay the life insurance inside the corporation, and we can pay it in such a way that that life insurance is no longer an expense, it's an asset. So we're starting to put money into this life insurance. Maybe we've been doing it for years already. Now it's going to start accumulating a cash value because we're going to start altering it so it's an asset instead of an expense. So there are two things that we can do with this. One, we can just let that start to grow. So now this expense that we used to have is growing as an asset. So that's the very simple plan. We've just converted the way that we're dealing with our life insurance so that it's no longer simply an expense. It's actually a policy or like a bank account where we're putting money in, and that money will grow over time and it will become an asset, and the money will grow tax-free.
Carl, I wanted to interject because I remember we chatted about this last week, but what I like the most about this is you can begin kind of converting, because if people already have it existing, or maybe if they don't have a policy yet, they can even start this from day one. Like they don't have to wait until a certain threshold, until the life insurance policy matures, or maybe like it gets to a certain amount. You can begin doing this like right away, which I found that was pretty powerful.
Yeah, definitely. So we could start today. I'll get into that a little bit more into the second part of this, but definitely right, Hassan. Today, you could have this expense currently on your balance sheet. You could flip this directly into an asset, even the current policy you've got, so that this life insurance is starting to accumulate a cash value inside your corporation. So
and Carl, but what about, let's say, people that maybe they already have an existing policy, right? And you know how there's always those fine print, those loophole, there's always the fine print that might get in the way of doing this. But let's say for people that already have an existing policy, like, is there any common barriers that could prevent them from converting that expense into an asset, or not really? It kind of works universal for, regardless if you're just starting a new policy, if you already have one in existence. Like, do you kind of see any barriers?
Yeah, there are barriers. So if you already have a policy, there may be some barriers in qualifying for being able to convert it over to a new life policy. Yeah, exactly as Robert has said, it may be the wrong kind of policy. It doesn't actually convert. Or if you don't have a policy, you may be in a situation where you're not eligible for the insurance. So it is very difficult to put it in place. So people have to qualify both from a health perspective, and they have to qualify from a financial perspective to put something like this in place.
Got it.
So who was it? Was it Eddie who talked about the whole idea of leverage?
That was Mike.
Oh, sorry, that was Mike. Yeah, it was Mike. Started talking about leveraging. So now that we have this in place, we can talk about what we can start to do with this. So we can actually start to leverage. So those expenses that are going in. So this expense of life insurance, we can now borrow this money out. So say you're putting in, we'll say it's $50,000 that's going into the policy. We can borrow that $50,000 right back out again. So that money is going into the life insurance, that $50,000. It stays here and it grows tax-free. and then we borrow against it, similar to what we would do with our house. Say this with a house, that's what most people do personally. So they take an expense, and in this case, that expense is rent. So what they do is that expense of rent, they actually buy a home. And because that rent is now actually paying the mortgage of the home, they're building equity within their home, which they can now borrow out again if they want to use it for some kind of investment. You don't have to. The equity is growing right here already. The equity is growing in your home, or the equity is growing in the policy, but you can also use it for investments if you want. So that is a way of taking an expense that you already had, that rent expense, and starting to grow equity. This is a way of taking this insurance expense and starting to grow equity within the corporation. David Wong, yes, you can definitely take a whole life insurance plan that you've got personally, and you can put that up into the corporation. So what we'd want to do is, in your specific situation, we'd want to make sure it makes sense. I'm talking about concepts here generally. These concepts may not make sense for any one person individually. Generally speaking, this is a good concept for many people, but David, specifically with your question, putting that policy up into the corporation in many cases would be a good idea. You would have to look at your specific tax situation to see if it made sense for you. But that is the idea. Something like that would make sense. Primerica Life, Joseph, I haven't heard of many Primerica policies being the correct ones for this strategy. As Joseph, or as David identified, these generally are whole life policies that we're converting within the corporation. Primerica, from what I understand, does not have a whole life policy that would make sense in this kind of situation. But you could always start a new policy, and that would be a way of you converting that expense you're currently doing with Primerica into something that would make more sense as a way to start building equity within the corporation. Sorry, I talked a little longer than I expected to. I'm happy to take some questions right now. So I'm just reading over your question, Mike. So in your example, are we double expensing the expense of adding to the policy and assuming 100% loan to value the interest payments from the loan when leveraging the life policy? So Mike, you do have the option. It all depends on your cash flow, basically. So in any specific situation, we would need to look at your cash flow. So really, say you've got a cash flow, an expense of life insurance, and say that was $1,000 a month. If you needed the same coverage, we would need to increase that for a strategy like this to say $5,000 a month. If you didn't necessarily need the same coverage, we could just keep that at $1,000 a month and convert that to a whole life policy where this would start to gain cash value. So it all depends on your specific situation and what your needs are. Either we would need to increase the expenses, or we would need to, or we wouldn't. And in that case, we could keep the expenses the same. So sorry, Riz, I'll just be one more sec with Mike. When we look at the whole idea of converting this over in this situation where we're actually borrowing the money back out again, we wouldn't start to double up on the expenses because we would be able to borrow the money back out. So let me show you how the money flow works. So say we're currently putting in $5,000 a year into a policy. So what we decide to do instead is we decide to take out a policy, and that policy is $50,000 a year. That's how much goes into the policy. So you might look at that and you say, wow, I'm really increasing the amount of cash that's going into this because I've gone from $5,000 into $50,000. But as we identified before, you could potentially borrow this $50,000 back out again. As you identified, Mike, you do have to pay interest on this $50,000. Say that interest, it's not going to be this high, but just for simple numbers, say that interest was 10%. Then your actual expense is $5,000 on that. So your expense didn't change, but now you have this $50,000 growing for you inside the corporation. So you did manage to convert this expense of the $5,000 a year that you're putting into the insurance into this expense of $5,000 that you're putting in to interest. And this policy is now growing for you and earning equity inside your corporation. So I think it's a little complex. I hope I answered your question there properly, Mike. Oh, cool. Thank you. So, and then Riz, just to confirm, if a whole life policy is corporately owned, does the CEO have to be in a reasonable good health to qualify? Yeah, reasonable. They have to be in a reasonable health. They don't necessarily have to be in good health, but they do have to be in reasonable health. Another part to this question, though, another answer to this question, there is a concept that we have inside the life insurance industry, and that concept, it's a little bit of a dirty word, but it's borrow a life. So sometimes what we do is we look at the business case and we want to be reasonable about it. Maybe there's a CEO, and that CEO is not going to qualify for life insurance for whatever reason. They've got diabetes or cancer or some kind of serious illness. And there's a CFO, maybe that CFO is the spouse of the CEO of the company, and that CFO is in quite good health. So what we can do is, instead of putting the insurance on the life of the CEO, we put it on the life of the CFO, and now all of a sudden we're back in business, even though that CEO would not have qualified. So part of our job is always to be a little bit creative. We always want to definitely do things properly, but we want to be creative in coming up with solutions for clients as long as they make sense, right?
Because everyone's financial situation is slightly different, and even if you have a business, everyone's business is slightly different with cash flow as well. I'd highly recommend you to give Carl a call or email him and just talk to him about your specific situation. See if Carl can come up with a strategy or some ideas that can help you in your specific situation. Thanks, guys, for attending this webinar. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys for next month's webinar. Like I said, if you have any specific questions about your specific situation, feel free to reach out to Carl. His email is in the chat, as well as his phone number. If you need his phone number, just reach out to us and we can give you his phone number as well. Thanks for attending this webinar, and we'll see you next month.